And hello. So, if you may recall or may not recall, I was a part of the Benny's HR Advisory Conference annual meeting in May. And my particular topic was around the economy and how it's affecting jobs. And when you're doing reflection or types of retrospection, right, there are times when things make sense and times when things don't. And there's also times where something lives with you for so long that you feel like you have to correct it. And this is one of those things. So I had an hour conversation in the main session. And I will tell you, it has been a long time since I've done an in-person live presentation. And quite honestly, it wasn't what I wanted it to be. And that's on me. Like, I take full responsibility. It wasn't where I think it should have landed. I wasn't able to focus on the things that I wanted to focus on because I kind of went down a tangent on other ways. And so hopefully there were some nuggets of wisdom in there that people could apply. And I did have several positive comments, but over the last 2 weeks since that particular point in time, I just haven't been able to let this die down or rest, right? I have not had a chance to really get over my feeling of it didn't really deliver the message that I wanted to deliver. And it didn't really resonate in the way that I felt like this was a good presentation. And somebody who really cares a lot about delivering something to you as the individual to take away and to also just be able to facilitate success in your own work, I just couldn't let it die. And so I'm doing a quick kind of recap / diving into the items that I want to dive into for this particular topic. And this isn't sanctioned by anyone. This isn't approved by anyone. This is truly just me doing this. And so hopefully I'm not breaking any rules by doing this, by utilizing, the same template that Benny gave me for this particular annual meeting. But I don't feel as though it is right to let it live and breathe and die where it did, and hopefully create a better dialogue around this to where I can feel better in moving on. And then also hopefully helping people who wanted to learn in this topic, but didn't necessarily walk away with something that may have been prolific. Again, I did receive positive comments, so I don't want to make it sound like I completely bombed, but to me, it was one of those things where I just didn't feel right. And I want to, of course, correct that. So that's really what this is. And thanks for going on this journey with me. But essentially, this was from the Benny's HR Advisory Annual Meeting. And that's every May. And they do an incredible job providing support, free support, and a community for those in the HR space. Benny is a benefits broker. I work with Benny a lot. I have since 2020. I'm a big believer of what they do and how they do it. I bring them to a lot of my clients and I bring them to a lot of the employers that I've worked at because they have simply just been the best to work with. So I am a little biased in that regard. And so I do share that bias, but that's just what they do and how they do it and why they're the best at what they do. So as we just kind of dive in here. So my particular topic was the economy and how it affects jobs and what that really means at a macro and micro level and how to implement some type of change within that and navigating that. And so that was the main topic. And how I started that conversation was with a poll. And it's something that obviously in a virtual setting is not as easy, but I want to have the same context and content as well in this particular one-on-one with you and me. And so the question itself was, how many of you have been impacted by the changes in the economy over the last few years? And I had people raise their hands. And I even made the comment that if you're not raising your hand, you should be raising your hand because everything that has happened between COVID, the housing market bubble crashing in again in like 2020, and then the prices raising with the rates, and then the rates raising again, and the price, like the whole buyer and demand and all that jazz from the housing market to the economy to the layoffs that are happening from a tech perspective. Every single individual in the room should have had their hand raised because everybody in the room was an HR professional or within these people's space itself, whether that was HR or another type of profession in that space, right? And so that was kind of what that is. And it's a common question that I want you to also think about. How have you been impacted? You could have been laid off. You could have been transitioned. You could have had to deal with creating those layoffs. You could have had to deal with trying to completely have no budget and do more with less, right? So in one way, shape, or form, we were all impacted by the changes. And that just shows how critical this information and knowledge and knowing how to navigate that is, in my opinion. And so I also kind of did another quick poll. I love metaphors. And there was a client that I brought up in terms of just talking through this photo here. So I have a client that I used to work with that was for coaching. I do a lot of HR coaching for Department of Ones and also just leadership coaching. And we kind of came across this metaphoric way of explaining how we're acting in our profession. And often in an HR scenario or in a people space, we have to be reactive. We have to facilitate the answer to whatever is occurring. And I associated that with the imagery or the metaphor of a turtle. And so oftentimes, how do you feel like a turtle, right? Like we're just kind of in our shells. We have our protections of like legalities and things that we have to say. But oftentimes we're just very reactive and we're just taking things as they come and adjusting accordingly, right? Leadership comes to you and says, I need a layoff tomorrow. Now you got to figure that out. So I reissued this idea around with this particular client and also with this group that we want to be hawks. We want to take us from being a turtle to a hawk. A hawk is the idea of proactiveness, being able to view the land, being able to see everything from a high level, understanding the nuances and the concepts and all the different things that are occurring so that we can be prepared to make shifts and do changes as that wind shifts, right? So a hawk is somebody that can really facilitate that high level view and understanding and have a plan prepared for quote unquote attack, right? They're able to navigate that much easier because of that high level view and understanding, right? And I even closed out this particular poll of like, how many of you feel like you are, turtles, and how many of you feel like you're a hawk? And I want you to also kind of sit with that question. Like, are you more reactive in what you do and want to be more proactive? Or are you somebody who is more proactive and you want to keep continuing sharpening those skills? And at the end of the day, the conversation was that we need both in our roles. There are going to be times when we have to be reactive, and there are going to be times where we want to be proactive. But primarily, we want to make the shift from being reactive all the time to being more proactive, especially when it comes to the economy and the things that occur that we have to deal with in our job. So that's really what this particular poll was about, and something to think about. And I also kind of brought this poll back into it, right? And very similarly to what we just discussed, how the economy impacts our job and how everyone's hand should have been raised. And that we want to be hawks because this is such a macro level piece of information that impacts our day-to-day in our people space. And we have to facilitate that navigation with little to no heads up or even little to no resources. And that's really difficult to do. And so the spoiler alert, so to speak here, was that our work is directly related to the economy. What we do is directly related to how the economy behaves. We are often reactive because of leadership changing ways based on what's happening in the economy. And we want to move from a turtle to a hawk, where we can be proactive and ready for those shifts and having those conversations with leadership to facilitate a better way of addressing or navigating these economic shifts and changes. And so that was kind of how we started the conversation internally. And of course, I did a little intro. So for those who don't know me or who did not see me speak at this particular event, my name is Kelly Loudermilk. I am a talent innovator with Build HR. I have been in the people space for 13 plus years now. And I've done it across being a department of one, and I've done it across being a department with 20 people. And I've led departments that have had, multiple different group sizes as well. So my specialty is scaling departments, HR departments, either from the ground up or having to rebuild from scratch from the ground up for scaling. So I've had to touch literally every aspect of the people space over the course of my 13 years. And I've been lucky enough to work in company sizes as small as 3 people and as large as 15,000. And I've been lucky enough to be able to facilitate it across multiple different types of verticals as well. even like within, manufacturing with unions all the way to like tech startup, like AI oriented work, right? And so it's been really exciting to have a lot of those opportunities. But in those opportunities, I've been in the trenches. I've had to dig through things. I've had to be creative and think of ways to do something that I have to do for free because I can't afford to pay any more money towards cost, right? Because it's cutting costs. So the main message was do more with less, right? So that's something that I've had an incredible experience and that I like to share on. Another thing that you'll see here in my little bio here is that I love metaphors. I absolutely adore metaphors, and I utilize them, as you see with the turtle and the hawk method that we talked about. As well as I am a mother of two. That's just a fun fact about me. And one of the things that it says at the bottom that was a little bit bigger on the screen in live was that I'm a believer of the projection of the people space. And I believe that we started it in the HR realm. That's where we have a lot of people still. We've evolved to that next level of people operations. And there's a whole other conversation around how the perception of HR and people ops and people fighting about what that means, how that is, and wanting to change that perception. So they're trying to evolve to people operations. I'm somebody who believes that the next step is people success. That's going to be our next evolution within our space. But the final evolution and really the ultimate piece that we want to get to is talent innovation, because talent innovation really addresses people success, people operations, and HR infrastructure. So that is what I personally believe is the projection in the future of our profession. I like to call myself a talent innovator, and I just recently spoke, or will be speaking at, since it's going to be scheduled, another virtual event with Mavericks, Eddie's Mavericks conference in June of 2023 around talent innovation a little bit more. So that's something that I'm really passionate about. But that's a little bio about me that we covered if you have not seen me before. And so the agenda for this particular conversation that we had, right, was that we wanted to create the hawk's eye view of tackling the economy. Again, that metaphor that I love. So definition and alignment is huge. Perception and manipulation was another huge piece here, taking flight and then getting that kind of bird's eye view and putting it all together. That was the agenda that we laid out here today. So definition and alignment. I spent a lot of time on definition and alignment in the actual live session. I think this is where I got a little sidetracked, to be completely honest, and why I think I lost some of that oomph that I really wanted to walk away with as a speaker. And so that's one of these things that I want to kind of like course correct here. So definition alignment is huge. And this is something that I believe in how I try to coach my leadership teams and how I try to create infrastructures for transition and times of change. Communication is huge to me, and definition and alignment is because what I am saying and what you are hearing could be two different things because of all the different types of things that you have in your hardwiring and your experiences. Similar words may have a different connotation or meaning for you than what I am intending them to mean. And so there can be a huge misalignment or just a gap in communication, even though we're still speaking English. This is something that I talk about a lot with my leadership team, and even something that I talked about with the Mavericks conference as well. And so it's really what I wanted to bring into this conversation at the HR advisory annual meeting. And this is kind of where I went on that tangent, was breaking that kind of gap down and why it was so important to have a similar definition here. And so to kind of like just, shrink that up, because I want to spend the time that I had really around the like actual execution in the real world examples. But for the purpose of this kind of course correction, essentially alignment and definition is critical, because although we may be speaking the same language, our communication may be different based on that type of perception or assumption that comes from my communication. So for here, I wanted us to ground together in a common language around what is the economy. And the economy is this huge overarching mechanism within our ecosystem, right? And it's really fundamentally going down to supply and demand. That's the most common theme that you see in education and economic classes. I think it was in my macroeconomics class that we talked about like the butter and beer example of supply and demand and different types of economic changes. And so this particular graphic was really kind of showcasing the relationship that we have even at our job level and our income level, and how we help supply the economy flow and ebb, right? And so we get income, we spend that money on companies. Companies get that income and can either facilitate their supply so that they can increase demand, or they have to like handle the cost, right? So there's an expenditure there too. And then they get theirs from their suppliers, so on and so forth. So it's a huge like interactive web that we're intertwined with each other and how this works. And the other thing about the economy that we talk about is, quite honestly, it's kind of similar to the Monopoly game in the sense that there is a rule maker, like the banker always wins, right? And I even gave that example. My brother was always the banker when we played Monopoly, and he would always win. Whether or not that was on purpose, who knows? But essentially, the banker in this case is the government. There's an extra layer of a complexity that comes to this quote unquote game of supply and demand and giving money for goods, et cetera, and services. And the government comes into play where they're trying to maintain and monitor this whole mechanism in a way that doesn't collapse. And so they add extra rules in there, such as raising the federal interest rates to ensure that we can kind of lower that buying ability to slow things down. But that has ripple effects, right? Just like when we lower the interest rates and buying ability power increases. And so you see all the things that have occurred where things are more costly because it's more competitive. And now we got like people who are hiring a crap ton of people. Interest rates have become higher. Money is more expensive to borrow. That lowers your purchasing power, meaning I have higher costs now. I need to get rid of extra headcounts. We're not making sales, so on and so forth. So how the government makes the rules to this quote unquote game of economy that we live in, if you want to kind of use that metaphor of monopoly, can have a direct impact on our day-to-day and how we operate. But then also an additional layer to that is the HR profession side or the people profession side that we now have to navigate because of these changes that businesses make that are like, nope, now you got to do this, or nope, and now we got to do that, right? Common theme, do more with us. So that is the definition that we tried to ground in on. And I shortened this quite a bit, but again, that's where I need to course correct. And that's why I think it's important to do so. So we talked about how that common definition played in our roles in the people ops space. So unemployment rates, job growth, training and development, and employee benefits are 4 key areas where things are really directly related to how the economy is. And I gave this example of causation versus correlation. And so we do have a causation direct experience in our jobs to the economy. If the economy does X, our jobs often have to do Y. There's a direct causation relationship. But there's also a correlation in the sense that in the people ops space, especially in my experience as a department of one, we have probably about 9 or 10 different verticals within the people space that we manage when it comes to the different things around the employee life cycle or expectations, development, training, those types of things. Benefits, like these are all small verticals that we encounter. So there's probably about 9 or 10 on average in the people space that we own in verticals in our businesses. And so there's a correlation between those two. And there was a statistics bureau out of Australia that I was researching when I was researching this topic that talked about how correlation and causation don't necessarily have a lot of very clear definitions between all the statistics. There is a clear high-level understanding of them, but there's so many nuanced areas around it that they were saying that like you can use very generic type of definitions because it can get so convoluted and complex. And I even used that particular information in there, but I think I possibly communicated, which is another reason why I'm trying to, course correct. But essentially, there is a direct correlation between all of our verticals due to the direct causation that happens from the economy. So another example here was when it's hot. There is a direct causation of when it's hot, more often ice cream sales go up. There's a direct reason. If then type statements, right? If it's hot, then sales of ice cream goes up. If it's hot, then crime rates go up. Phoenix is a really good example of this. Phoenix crime rates often exponentially grow in the summer because it's also freakishly hot there. But ice cream and crime are not directly linked, but there is a correlation in that in the sense that they're both increased when it's hot. And so it's a kind of an example of how in our jobs, some of these things with the unemployment rates, how that changes directly correlates and causates and impacts different things when it comes to like recruiting and things like that, right? But that same mechanism can have a correlation with other things around like benefits, growth, training, and development between the different verticals. And so there is a direct relationship on a day-to-day basis to what we do in our jobs and how the economy comes into play to that. And that was kind of what we talked about here. And we were using common definitions around real world examples. So really great examples of how these direct causations and correlations happen. COVID-19 is probably the largest example that we have all lived through and survived for the most part, right? Because the burnout is still very, very real of a direct causation. COVID caused us to shut down. Whether you are from the hospitality industry, whether you are from the service industry, even manufacturing industry, we had to physically stop in a lot of ways. That stopped income, that stopped money. Businesses were no longer making money. Some of them took advantage of government types of programs to help them facilitate their success. But for the most part, a lot of what they had no longer was there. And it's kind of ironic that everyone always preaches like you should have at least 6 months of savings for emergency situations. But a lot of the businesses don't follow those same practices. It's always preach, 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 but don't practice what I preach, right? So there was a lot of cuts after that point in time. A lot of positions were cut. It's a direct causation. COVID happened, jobs got cut, direct causation. COVID happened, we have to pivot to remote. And I even gave a good example of a company that happened in Westminster, Colorado, in my area. They were a wing joint, super awesome wings, like absolutely adore them. They are directly dealing with COVID and everything shutting down. And they had an amazing pivot of saying, you know what, we've never really done takeout. We've never really done like drive-in type of scenarios when it comes to delivering the food. They completely pivoted their entire business model in probably less than a week in response to what happened with COVID and getting shut down. And they were able to maintain success over COVID and probably actually exponentially grow their success following COVID. And so that was a really good example that I showcased or talked through where they were being hawks. Those particular owners, they were a small business owner. They may not have necessarily had a people person in their space, but they were hawks in that situation where they saw what was going on, they saw what was going to happen, and they pivoted really quickly with that to ensure that they continued success. But because of that, right, COVID happened, we changed causation, but the correlation with that change that they made was that they were able to keep their staff and they were able to keep money flowing and they were able to ensure that people had jobs and people had, like takeout still, right? And that's what's led to their success. And they've expanded since then. But it was a really awesome way to see that. Another example was the political wars that we encounter on a day-to-day basis, the wonderful back and forth tit for tats that we see across nations. The biggest one was around China, right? We've had a lot of tariff wars with China in regards to our imports and exports. That has a direct causation on costs for companies. So I worked for a nutritional company back in the day in Boulder that actually had suppliers coming from China, and there was a tariff, as well as because of COVID, a huge backlog, right, on trying to bring in supplies from China. And that caused a direct causation on cost of services. And we already had a smaller margin, which had a correlation impact of changing budgets and changing things that we had initially, right? And so that's another direct kind of definition of how these examples in the real world play into the day-to-day on just our, humble abodes of people operations, right? Similarly with the housing market, with the changes of, supply and demand and costs and things like that. And I even gave an example of when, I've had to help move people cross country for a job, and based on just different things that have occurred from like tech layoffs and money being more expensive and stuff, and they were getting settled into a house, they got their offer rescinded. They moved across country and got their offer rescinded and having to deal with that. So that was another example of how these macroeconomic moves or these things that impact the macroeconomics, that are happening, we have to see and deal with that on a day-to-day basis in our job. And that was kind of what these examples were of what we've had to kind of go through. So kind of showcasing that this is a cyclical cycle, right, on how this impacts. So a lot of those examples are around these similar things. And a common theme is like do more with less, because oftentimes when money costs more, budgets go down. When money costs less, budgets go up. So it's a very common cyclical cycle that we see within the economic forms. And you see it all the time. People are commenting about how it's like, oh, it's a cycle, it's going to repeat, it's going to repeat. We're due for a recession, we're due for a recession, things like that. And so being prepared for that and taking that into consideration as you become material to a hawk. That's really what that was for. So this was the next step that we really talked about here. And I wanted to I can't necessarily go through this exercise with you, so to speak, but I can talk through it and then kind of focus where we want to focus in terms of this course correction. So I gave a quick poll. I was like, the economy and news, how do you get it? Like, what is the type of way that you receive your information when it comes to, the news or the economy? Some people mentioned that they get it from radio. Some people mentioned that they get it from social media. Some people mentioned that they get it from the news. One person even mentioned that their husband actually works in the economy and in financial industry. And so that they got directly from him. And I was like, that's awesome. You kind of have a cheat code there to life when it comes to the economy. So it was a great example there. But the reason why I asked this is because of this particular exercise. So I want you to look at these two circles. And before you think anything about these two circles, I want you to know that they are not the same size. They're absolutely, positively 100% different sizes. And so I asked the group, based on knowing that, who believes the red is bigger than the blue? And they raised their hands. And who believes the blue is bigger than the red? And they raised their hands. And I mentioned, before I ever said that these sizes were different, what did your gut tell you? Like, what was your gut instinct about these two particular circles? And it was, quite honestly, that they're the same size, right? Because they are the same size. And I got almost everyone in the auditorium to raise their hands for one or the other. And it was a good example to walk through. I actually saw it on social media, right, as a way to showcase manipulation and how easy it is to manipulate somebody to believe something against their direct instinct within a minute flat, if not sooner. And so I use this particular tactic and example to showcase the importance of where we're getting our information. And so although I can't necessarily do that exercise with you, but I've kind of given you the idea. Obviously, the exercise took a little longer than just that moment, but the idea was to showcase these two circles, get people to disagree with their natural instinct, and showcase how easy it is that we get manipulated when we're getting resources from somewhere else. And the key thing here is, think about your leaders. Think about those who make decisions in your organizations. Where are they getting their news? Where are they getting their information about the economy? Where are they having those conversations? If you hear something long enough, say for instance, you are told from day one that the red circle is bigger forever, and it's constantly brought into your hardwiring to where you believe it unequivocally moving forward, then that's what you're going to do. That's what you're going to use when you're decision making, and that's what you're going to believe, no matter how often other resources or other things are telling you the opposite, that they're the same. So it's a really good example about how your leadership could be receiving information from areas that may or may not be accurate, or may be biased in some way or targeted in some way that creates a outcome or a decision that impacts things just based on the news that they're receiving. A good example of this that I mentioned was around a movie that Jake Gyllenhaal was in, and I believe it was something around a Nightcrawler or something along that time. And it was a news-based or journalism-based type of movie, and Jake Gyllenhaal did an incredible job in this movie. But the lesson to learn in that movie, and the lesson to kind of take away from that movie, was that blood cells, meaning the extreme cells, fear cells. So no matter where you're getting your information, there are going to be different types of biases, there are going to be different types of inputs that you're going to be seeing from all different types of areas now, because our attention spans are shorter, that are going to constantly be pushing fear and the extreme idea, because that's what sells, that's what grabs our attention. So whether or not it's truly accurate, we don't really look at, because if we're told something long enough or believe something long enough, we're going to believe it against our natural instincts, because that's just how we are as human beings. So that was really the point of this particular piece, that it's still really critical to understand. And the takeaway is that how we get information and how we view it is extremely important. It matters. We are human. We are manipulated constantly by marketing techniques, sales techniques. Like there are literally professions that work off manipulation to get a result that they want. Similar with news. It is a huge piece there. And so a good example of this was kind of like the market makes a move, right? Interest rates increase. We have the housing crisis, the pandemic, there's a war, there's trade wars going on, right? People are chatting, chit chat, chit chat. They get their stuff from the news, from podcasts, articles, social media, networking. Leaders to leaders just have a bunch. What are you doing? Oh, I should probably do that too. Do you have inside information? Do you not? Right? And they make decisions off of that. Now, I'm not just associating that leadership's going to make decisions willy-nilly, but they have a job to do for their shareholders. They are held to an expectation that they make profit, just like how a lot of us are held to expectations around our metrics. And so they're going to make decisions based on that input that has a direct causation to your job, whether that's a layoff, whether that's hiring freezes, whether that's hiring increases, whether that's your cost increasing so you have less to work with. The common theme, again, that we hear a lot in our profession. And I even mentioned it was in Benny's annual magazine that they have, that they ship out to their HR advisory team members. There is a huge page that just said the common theme for our profession is do more with less, but you got to keep our people. It's critical. We got to keep our talent, but you got to do more with less. Like you can't have this, this, and this, but you got to like keep them happy, right? And so that's a direct scenario. So that was a lot of context building up of like the economy and why it's important and kind of the interactions that we have and how it can impact to our day-to-day and what we have to deal with on a regular basis and how to prepare for that as well. So that was kind of the main pieces that we talked about. Unfortunately, I focused too much on that in our conversation when I did the one-on-one, a lot of the context building so that we could talk the same thing, that I had to shortfall on the real world side of things. So I wanted to spend more time to talk through how we are reactive and to move us to being proactive, moving from a turtle to a hawk. And so taking flight, so to speak. So what can we do to be more proactive? Well, a lot of times in our space, we have to, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. And we got to completely throw that away and truly see all that's going on, truly hear all that's going on, and truly speak to it. We have to be able to speak to it to inform our leadership team members to make decisions that are based in different types of things that are just outside their outside influences. We have to be listening to different types of trends, talking to different companies, talking to different professions of what they're seeing, understanding what's happening in the market, and we have to visually understand and see everything. So we have to really try to change how we interact with the world, so to speak, in some way, shape, or form, and add this extra input into our day-to-day so that we can speak to it properly. A good example is like looking at what companies are doing in these times of change. A wonderful one is Gravity Payments. They're super famous for making a livable wage as their minimum wage. People said they were crazy because they did that in a time of economic difficulties, right? They have flourished. When difficult times came around profitability, they talked about it candidly and they made a change. They didn't do layoffs. Everyone agreed, like the CEO had a conversation, saw this coming, had a conversation with people and said, what do you want to do? And everyone's like, we'll take pay cuts. Like nobody loses their job. And that's what they did. And so like there are ways to navigate these difficulties in a way that still impacts work and the human experience positively. But we have to be like open visually, auditorily, and vocally in order to do so. So I wanted to talk through this a little bit about sharpening our claws, right? Like how do we like become the hawk? And some of these steps are what we talked through. Really just watching the market, understanding some of those nuances. I am not an economist, but I like talking about this because I like people science and I like people in the workplace and what I do. So I'm able to bring in that interest and how it can be applied to the economy, right? So that's how I kind of like can talk about this, even though I'm not an economist, but understanding when the price of money goes down, the ability to borrow money for income or to finance money for investments, money flows because it's cheaper, meaning that like people are going to invest. We have more budgetary alignment. We're able to invest more. We're able to rapidly grow, which is what a lot of people did post-COVID. They rapidly grew, expecting things to change and completely drastically like be positive from the get-go, right? But that's not what happened when our interest rates keep rising. Money becomes more expensive. Money doesn't flow as easily. Just to do one thing is now more expensive to the bottom line, which means we can't spend as much, which means I can't do as many things. I can't spend as much on benefits. I can't spend on much in like learning and development, right? Because those are things that don't directly relate to my revenue. That's not true, as we know, but we have to learn how to communicate that and prepare for that, right? And create plans around that. So watching the market is super important. Seeing and hearing the conversations that are happening, again, that's super important. When you're able to visually understand what's happening and conceptually understand what's happening, you need to be where the conversations are. You need to have that seat at the table. That doesn't have to be from you directly. It can be from your leader or the people that you report into, but they need to have the confidence in you to directly relate that information to the leadership team. I think that this is going to be happening. I'm seeing the rates go up. I'm concerned about how that might impact our ability to, find competitive suppliers and how that increases our cost of services, right? And so what does that mean for our budget? What does that look like for our forecasting? What do we need to do to ensure that we can be successful and still meet the needs of our people while still being, monetarily conscious when it comes to these shifts? That's something that your leadership team can really buy into in terms of the conversation that still gets you the results that you want to talk about people, right? Confirming those impacts. I can't tell you how many types of things that I see every day in both news, social media, the radio. The recession is coming. The recession is coming. The recession's already here. The recession's already here. Oh, there is no recession. We're fine. Like all three viewpoints about just one item is everywhere right now. So confirming where that's coming from, confirming on whether or not that actually is something that may impact you. If you're in government work, hospital work, educational type work, there are certain things that don't really impact you because it's critical for the infrastructure of survival as a society, right? So those types of things may not impact you as much. And so like understanding those impacts and how you can facilitate the plan around that. And also just getting ready to execute plans. Part of being proactive is having a lot of different types of plans ready. So you have these types of plans ready where you're like, best case scenario, if I had everything I ever wanted, if I had all the money in the world, what would I be able to do with that, right? Worst case scenarios. My client talked about a worst case scenario that she was presented with in the sense that the company would shut down everything other than what's critically needed. And that was shared to the organization. It caused a lot of issues. I won't go into details there, but preparing for those worst case scenarios and how to operate is important. And you have to be a part of that conversation to know, because that's going to be important on how you execute everything that's occurring. In kind of the middle of those two, right? The must-haves versus the nice-to-haves, and just creating cost-benefit analysis. It doesn't matter if you're a department of 1 or if you're a department of 20. The leadership team will not really talk to you if you don't talk to them in the language they understand. And it's how much money is this going to cost versus the rate of return. So you have to understand that that is what they're going to look at, because they often see us as a cost center, and we have to facilitate the conversation properly around that. And having some sort of cost benefit analysis is going to be important. And you'll be really surprised on what you can create a cost benefit analysis for, even for that subjective type of topic. You can do it. It might take some time, but there are ways to measure the cost and the value that comes out of something as simple as doing a quarterly survey for wellness, things like that. So, in order to sharpen your claws to prepare for these things, you have to have a nail file. What are your resources, right? And so this is where I wanted to spend more time too. Your partners. So Benny's a great partner from a benefits perspective. Again, I really care about what they do, and I work with them a lot, primarily because they serve as a real partner. They give me resources, they take time off my plate so that I can facilitate the proper conversations where I need to. Similarly with your HRIS. I've implemented Rippling 3 times now. I'm moving on to my 4th implementation as somebody who just does it because I care about technology within the workplace. Utilizing what you have to the best of your ability, right? That is a particular HRIS system that I personally like, and that I think really helps me be successful by utilizing the infrastructure that they give to you to work in your favor, to save up time for other things. So automating, utilizing, and leaning on your partners. You would be surprised how much you can show and hold somebody accountable if you're working with them from a vendor partnership relationship. If they're not servicing you and acting as a real partner, they don't need your business. I will say that in the sense that like I had a broker that I was working with a previous client. I had an inside detail from a friend who works in a big major insurance provider, and she kind of taught me a little bit more about insurances because that was a newer area for me. And so I learned that commission is paid through your premiums. They get a commission, whether they say, oh, you don't pay us a cent, right? But no, you do. It's through your premiums that you're paying. So you don't necessarily see that, but they do. Legally, they have to tell you what your commission per month is per employee. If you ask, you have to ask. And I asked this particular individual, and he told me, I was like, but you don't do anything for me. You don't do help with open enrollment. You don't help me with like new hires. You don't help me with resources. You literally do nothing for me. What do you do for me for that commission? And they were like, well, we process this with your provider. I was like, that's not good enough for me anymore. And a representative from Benny at the time, they're no longer there at this point in time because they've moved on in their career. This was back in 2020, really talked about what they do and what they provide and the different types of support that they provide. And I was like, and they told me point blank, even before the sale was closed, what their commission per month was. Because I was like, well, how do you make money, right? Because like everybody has to make money. And they told me very easily and transparently. And so the decision was easy on my part. Changing brokers is super easy if you ever want to. It's literally a piece of paper that the plan administrator or owner signs to change your brokerage firm, right? So you can change to any broker however often you really want. There's no real requirement. Now, if you're on a PEO, that's a completely different situation. But that's just like a little piece of tidbit that you can take away. But you can change the partners that you have and the resources that you have to help you be successful. And I changed in this case to Benny because it was the right decision and allowed me to focus on what I needed to focus on and have a real partner. So utilizing your partners to free up space and time for you is critical. Your communities, right? Not being afraid to have and lean into those communities, ask questions, have conversations, understand what's happening. So your HR advisory with Benny is huge. It's a big, I started with them when they were like under 300 members. I think they're over 2,000 members now. So, and it's worldwide. So it's like a big deal there in that regard. I think it's primarily US based because of their work in the US, but I'm sure there are plenty of folks that still join that particular support group that may be outside the US. The HR Mavericks from Eddie, they're another great resource that has taken off lately that has been a really phenomenal, especially for those who are Department of Ones or those who have HR as ad hoc type of responsibilities. People Geeks is another resource community that is existed. That's Culture Amps resource community that they have. Lattice has a resource for humans as another one. So like there's a ton out there. You just have to take advantage of them to really navigate that. Your tech stack is another one. You would be surprised what you can do with less. So creating a LMS within maybe your project management tool, creating an entire review cycle with just a Google or Microsoft form and building out those different things. If you have to do more with less and you plan for that and really lean into your tech stack and understand the capacities that your tech stack has, you can do that easily. So again, it's that proactive approach to sharpen your claws, to be proactive and understand how to navigate these changes. You have to understand what you have in your pockets, your resources, so that you can navigate these changes. And I love this picture of the bamboo here because bamboo is a huge metaphor for me that I like to sell in terms of like how I approach things when I'm either interviewing or talking to a client, right? Bamboo is phenomenal. It is an infrastructurally hard plant that grows and is phenomenally like strong, but it is also extremely bendy. And as I like to say something more cliche like, bamboo is a strong infrastructure that can bend in the wind of change. And that's what you're trying to build here to be from a turtle to a hawk, creating infrastructures and policies, procedures, practices, plans that can be very strong and rooted in the core of your business, but can change quickly as the wind changes, right? And still be strong and stable in that regard. And that's really what you're trying to create here with your resources. So I wanted to spend time on an actual example, like let's hunt, right? That's where this got really slowed down and like quick here. And so I wanted to kind of take this time to go through that with you. Okay, so let's hunt. The example here was that the interest rates are rising, right? So money costs more. We've talked about that a lot in regards to just things that are occurring in current situations with the economy. So that means there's not more money coming in. Your supplies for your cost of services are going up, especially if you're an e-commerce type of business or you're dealing with hard things that are in trade, right? Or if you've been just in services, the cost of labor is going up as well. So all these things are becoming more costly. So what is the impact to business? What's going to happen? Where does that leave your budgets? Talking to your finance, parts of your resources, right? So you have an FCO or a CFO? Do you have a head of finance? Do you have a associate director or director of finance? Somebody who's monitoring the books, right? So what does this mean to our forecast? If we don't have as much money to really facilitate these programs, or where do we need to move money around to ensure that we can continue when it comes to not having as much money coming to the door, right? So you understand the impact of the business in this particular case. So how will leadership pivot? Talking about, okay, we have less money coming in the door, more money going out based on that. We are trying to facilitate that we have people buying our stuff. So how do we pivot? Do we create sales? Do we create initiatives to bring in revenue while also cutting costs? Okay, cutting costs are happening. What does that mean? Do you have somebody that is there to advocate for you in your role and in the HR space or the people space around cutting costs, right? So having that conversation. Okay, I hear that you want to cut costs. Where do you want to cut costs? Okay, so say for instance, you want to cut costs on the nice to haves that we have currently, the perks that we have. Leadership development is an easy one, right? That often gets cut. Learning and development often gets cut. Different types of perks and benefits and like nice to have things. So, okay, I hear what you're saying. This is a coaching technique. I hear what you're saying is that we need to cut costs to increase the ability that we can move money to the areas that are required. In this particular case, what are the most important things to you when it comes to your people here? What do you care about when it comes to your people? The leadership team could be saying a lot of different things. They could be saying that, well, we only care about them feeling psychologically safe, that their job is secure, right? We don't care about anything else right now. Or they could also be saying, we care about them staying engaged and not losing you one to somebody else who's hiring that has more nice things, right? We care about retention. If that's what they care about, then that's where you need to go. So you figure out what they care about when you're learning how the leadership team will pivot. They're going to make a decision. The goal is by leaning into your resources, by having conversations, by having connections in the workplace and being able to facilitate that conversation, speak the same language. You can have a real conversation with the leadership team that says, I hear you need to do X. What does it mean to you when it comes to Y? So that I can deliver both X and Y, right? And so having the ability to just understand that could be your leader, your manager, having those conversations. But they also have to be bought into this idea of your position becoming a hawk and being able to facilitate this in the way that both the people need from a people experience standpoint and the business needs. And the steps that we can take. So an example, somebody actually asked this question in our session. And it was around how to build like an onboarding program when you have nothing, or kind of learning and development. So we'll say for this example, and this is where we didn't get to spend a lot of time, so that's why I want to spend time here. For this particular example, leadership has said, I care about doing more with less. I want to keep our people happy and engaged. And I want to cut all costs that we can associate with that too. Like any type of nice perky things that we have. Okay, so we have to get rid of our learning and development budget. We have to get rid of our initiatives around certifications, reimbursements, and things like that are not like tax deductible types of benefits, right? Okay, so I know what we need, right? I know what you want at the end to retain and still keep people happy, but also cut these costs. For this particular example, utilizing that question of like an onboarding program or like learning and development, I know from, say, for instance, my previous surveys or pulse surveys that growth and development is a key element to keeping our people happy and retained. So I know that that's something that I can't lose in terms of an experience, but I also don't have money for, which was kind of similarly what the assumption was based on this question, right? We need to have this program, but we don't have money for it. Okay, so what steps can we take? What do we know? Who are the partners that we have that we can lean on, right? So who are your partners? What's your tech stack? So in this particular case, let's just use a tech stack that I've worked with before. We have a LMS with our HRIS, it's included. Say, for instance, you have to cut that cost, right? That's an extra, a couple of, $100 a month back in your pocket. Okay, totally understandable. We do have a project management tool in our belt, right? Say, for instance, maybe ClickUp or Asana, or Monday.com. And that is something so critical to the day-to-day operations, it will not be cut. Okay, so you know your tech stack. What is the capacity of your tech stack that can really house this type of stuff, right? Thinking outside the box. I know that tech stack can probably house maybe some documentation or some steps or some reminders that can facilitate what it might look like to walk through a learning and development type of training, right? And so facilitating that, building out that particular template. I know ClickUp has templates around like learning and development. I know Asana has a lot of templates. I know Monday.com has a lot of templates. Looking at their community templates, looking at different types of ways to frame those infrastructures. Those are infrastructures that are very if-then type of tasks. If I need you to do this, then you need to do that, and then click it complete, right? And it has a tracking mechanism, just like an LMS does with a certificate. You can create that with something that you have by leaning into the resources and tech stack that you have, right? And so really leveraging those things. But yet you still have to work out other things like the engagement pieces. Okay, so I know that I need to create some courses. I've never had to really create a course. We don't have a SCORM compliant person who can like whip it together, nor do we have an LMS for it to live in. Okay, well, I know that I can make PowerPoints, or I can make Google Slides, and I can put content on there, and I can make that live in my ClickUp or Asana infrastructure and have people go through that, right? Or do assignments through that. So you can really build out an onboarding experience or a learning and development experience with no real budget other than time, and utilizing the resources that you have, still creating the impact that you know is important to your leadership team. I still want people retained. I still want people happy, but all of your money is going away in order to do so, right? And so you have to get creative. That is a plan that you come up with. Like, that is your worst case plan, right? So we talked about having these different ways of understanding what the economy will do and having to be prepared, and the different types of plans that you should have in place from a strategic perspective when it comes to your people and the different verticals that you have, whether it's engagement, recruiting, retainment, compensation, whatever, right? And so for this particular example, we had, under a worst case scenario where there's no budget, but we still have to implement a plan around how we can facilitate something in the systems that we currently have. And as things get better, the nice to haves or the best case scenario can start to roll out and be delivered. And looking at LMSs or looking at coaching services or looking at performance management things, right? And so you can build out a lot with very little. It takes time, and it takes innovation, and it takes creativity, but you have to be comfortable with creating those plans to present when these types of situations happen at the leadership table. So the reason why that person asked the question was, how do you build out this kind of learning and development program when you have nothing? And the first question that I asked, similarly to what you would ask in this particular example of the leadership team, what do you care about? What's the experience? So I always work backwards from the experience. What do you want people to take away and experience from this message, from this moment, from this exercise, right? That's where you start to create, okay, what does that look like? What matters that needs to still be communicated in addition to creating that experience? Some of those more like compliant-based items. Okay, what are the resources that you can do and facilitate with that? Can you create an entire LMS just from Google Drive or from a project management system? You can, it is doable. It's a little tricky though. Can you create these different things in the environment that you have currently? Okay, what does that look like? What are the resources you can lean on? So for onboarding perspectives, I love having buddies or mentors. And there are often times where leadership team members don't want a mentor, but peers do. I love that. And a lot of people are like, no, what do you do when you have peers? No, that's not a bad thing. That's a leadership development opportunity. Now you're creating something for an onboarding while having a correlation, right, to leadership development and facilitating something from an experience perspective without a budget backwards that are having impacts positively in other areas. So you're creating a leadership opportunity for somebody that may be a peer, but knows how to navigate how the company operates. And that's something that's needed in an onboarding situation. And so you're able to get creative by leaning into the resources that you have, the partners that you have, the tech stack that you have, and understanding how to navigate that and having these different plans to know when you have absolutely nothing, what does that look like? When you have absolutely everything, what does that look like? If you have something in the middle, what can give and take? And being able to implement them as they change. Because as things get better for this particular example, right? Money's flowing, we're able to invest in learning and development, we're able to invest in coaches, we're able to invest in an LMS. You can kind of slowly start to push in those must-haves that you wanted, right? Make them more of those nice to haves that you had later on top. You start to implement those over time, and then also push in that best case scenario over time. So you want to start out with kind of that best case scenario and work backwards to the absolute worst case scenario when you're creating your different plans. That's how you're strategic. That's how you approach your thinking. And it doesn't have to be like executed on paper to the level of detail where like you have step A, step B, step C, but you have to have that in your mind and somewhere in the organization where they understand that too, because that's what happens when these economic impacts change. So the economy made it where you can't spend money, but your boss said, I still need this. How do you do that? That's exactly what we did here. We learned how to create something as a plan of attack, so to speak, in a way that still meets the experience and the needs of the individual, while still dealing with the impact and the causation that the economy has with our day-to-day. And that's really what matters here. And so that's just one small example, but it's a good example to showcase how to get really creative and think different than we've ever had before, but also moving you into that conceptual strategic space of having different plans, because that's really all it is when it comes to strategy. Having different plans of execution based on conditions. Like that's what it means to be strategic, being prepared. That moves you from being a turtle that's reactive, that I need layoffs tomorrow, to a hawk that says, okay, I know that things are not going well from a financial standpoint in forecasting. What does that mean from our headcount? Do we have the ability to transition folks? Because, for example, we have 40 positions open in these particular areas. Are we going to pause those roles or stop them altogether? Or with these people that we need to lay off, can we transition them in those roles to facilitate success? Do we have to physically do a layoff? Do we have other opportunities and ways to navigate that? Similarly to gravity payments, where we just all take pay cuts. Is that a reality that we can have? What does that look like? Can we cut back elsewhere before layoffs? Can we communicate that to our people? So let them know we are no longer going to be providing X, Y, and Z. The reason why is because we want to be smart and we don't want to have layoffs, and we need to conserve income flow to ensure that we have jobs, right? People understand the thing they care about is whether or not they have a job to be able to pay their bills. So even a really hard topic like layoffs, you can move from a turtle to a hawk by saying, I can see this happening in our forecast. I can see this happening in the macroeconomic environment. How is that going to play out for us? Are we impacted? Are we needing to be strategic in how we approach this? Is there another way that we need to be thinking about this, or have a plan prepared, like a kind of like a emergency plan, if you will, on if this topic comes up, how do we talk through that as a leadership team? How do we talk through that as an organization to ensure that we have the best case scenario for both our people and our business? That's really all this is. And that's really what it means to go hunting and become a turtle to a hawk. Now, granted, you're going to have moments of being a turtle. You're going to have to react. And you're going to have moments where you can be a hawk. But the idea is to give you more tools to facilitate transitioning from a turtle to a hawk when it comes to economic changes. So that's really what the hunting exercise was for. And we didn't get to spend a lot of time on that. And that was really something that I didn't like. So putting this all together, so stepping into your wings, so to speak, as a hawk, right? So you have to meet with your leaders. You have to have conversations. Don't be afraid to start learning about P&L and different analytics when it comes to the business. You have to speak their language. And as much as you may have really innovative, people-focused leaders that are phenomenal, they still care about the bottom line. They still care about their metrics that they're held accountable to, just like you are. And you have to understand what that is and speak that language with them to understand how to actually come up with a plan together and be true partners in that endeavor. So don't be afraid to meet with your leaders. Don't be afraid to ask, like, hey, I would love to pick your brain. Hey, I would love to talk to you, even if it's your associate director of finance, or even just another finance accountant in your organization. Like, I would just love to like kind of start picking your brain on what's going on and like see how we can learn from each other, right? Don't be afraid to have those connections to really understand what's happening. Talk early and often. There's so many things going on in the news all the time that's constantly coming at you 24/7. Don't be afraid to have those conversations. Hey, I'm hearing like that we're in a recession, right? But yeah, I'm seeing or hearing other things that say the recession's not coming yet and we're still going to see it. And I also see that we're not going to have one. What's your take on that? Like, what do you think? What are you seeing? Not being afraid to have those difficult conversations and just more out of a curiosity standpoint to learn than anything else will help get you reciprocated responses. Amplify others in your areas, right? So I mentioned a lot of examples where you may not be at the leadership table, but your manager may be, or your leader may be. Amplifying others is an extreme way to help facilitate success for you and for the people operations space, or just people in general. A good example of that was when Obama's house had a lot of female that he brought in. He brought in a lot of female leaders into his administration. And it's a really well-known study that occurred around amplification, where a lot of females would be speaking or bringing up ideas in these different meetings, but often they would get forgotten or lost in translation. And then they would get brought up again by a male counterpart and then taken more seriously. So the women in that particular administration banded together and facilitated, I'm going to start amplifying things. So I'm going to say, you know what, Susie, that was a phenomenal idea. I really want to talk more about that. Let's circle back to that, right? Like, you got to have that fun little business back and forth cliche saying, circle back, king you, all that jazz, right? So really amplifying others' ideas. If you think somebody else's idea is great, don't try to steal it or anything, just amplify it. And they will start to reciprocate, or even have a plan between you and your manager, or you and fellow leaders, or you and other folks in your organization to start amplifying conversations, right? Saying, oh, we talked about our finances having difficulties in our forecasting. And, Susan brought that up in our last meeting. I really want to talk about that and really what that impact could be from our people strategy side of things. What can we talk through there? So again, amplifying can really help to bring home those messages. Ensuring those plans and steps, that was going back to kind of what we talked about, that by being strategic. It's really facilitating these different types of situations and plans, preparedness for how these things can shift, because that moves you into that thought leadership space. That moves you into that leadership space at the leadership table where you're a trusted advisor. I know you have a plan for this. Let's talk through that. Those types of steps can help ensure that you move from being a turtle to a hawk. Knowing the execution details, you don't have to have it planned to the 9th degree, right? But you have to understand what the reality is of that plan. You can't just say, well, I'm going to create an LMS out of thin air. You have to understand, I have no money for an additional cost. I have to facilitate some sort of learning and development program from an onboarding perspective, or even a leadership development perspective. What can I do? What's the reality of that? I know, what are your knowns? I know that I have a applicant tracking system. I know that I have a Google Suite, and I know that I have a project management system. I can integrate those different things in different ways to ensure I have a really strong onboarding process and a really strong leadership development process. So knowing the details of what the reality is of execution is going to be important, because otherwise a plan is a plan with nothing. If you don't know how to execute it in your world or your reality, it's never going to happen. And it's never going to go anywhere. And you're going to lose all of that projection and motivation to be a hawk. And of course, understanding the employee impact and perception. This kind of goes back to that manipulation and perception piece, right? And just even communication. You'd be surprised how often, if you don't have all the answers, all you have to really showcase is that you don't have all the answers and that you're really trying to work through them, and just communicating that. You have to own those perceptions that the employee has, understanding what that impact is. Because a lot of times when we hear news of any type of way, when an organization shift happens, it's like, have I lost my job as well? How does this impact my work, right? Whether it's a layoff, a separation of somebody else, whatever that happens. Those are the 2 most common questions I prepare managers to get ready for, because those are the 2 most common questions that come out of any type of separation or transition when it comes to, economic changes such as losing your job or other types of people leaving. Am I next? What does this mean for my workload? So knowing that impact or that perception that an employee is going to have, and preparing the communication standardization around that can help in a lot of these different ways as well, to step into that hawk mode, to be more proactive and be ready for it. And so it's kind of a way that you fly into talent innovation. And talent innovation, again, I speak about it in another way, but it's truly just adhering to different ways of thinking and working, and building outside influences and bringing them into how you work. I bring a lot of neuroscience. I bring a lot of neurolinguistics and biology and fundamental human elements that I've learned from different areas like product management techniques, child psychology techniques. I've even brought in like dog training behavior techniques to different elements of how I execute or how I create structures. That is an example of talent innovation. It's taking outside influences and information and translating it in a way that makes sense for you in the people space. So you're going to learn from different industries. You're going to look at different companies like Gravity Payments and how they handle their layoff situation, right? You're going to see what works for you and what doesn't. You're going to learn from different methods of the areas that exist, like product management, design thinking. Those different types of elements that were made primarily for other industries and other types of professions can be applicable to what you do in different ways that are really creative. Applying it to your organization, what makes sense. Not everything is always going to make sense. Kind of like EOS, it's a entrepreneurial operation system, right? Love the idea and the concept. A lot of what they have doesn't always apply to your particular organization in the way that matters. Don't be afraid to say yes to some things and no to others. Make it work for you. And adjusting as you learn. The whole point of being strategic is adjusting and learning as you go and being able to pivot. And you have to be the person who creates the puzzle while building the puzzle. There's a lot of different pieces and elements to what we do on a day-to-day basis. And you are the one person that has the ability to pull puzzle pieces as you see fit. So while you're also creating the puzzle, you have to be able to understand that you can change that puzzle however you want as you keep going and, keep learning forward or failing forward, as I say, because you don't, just like with this situation, I don't think I did a very good job personally on my particular presentation live. I'm failing forward. I'm utilizing that by recreating this in a virtual environment to hopefully bring down the message that I cared about, which is putting this really into practice. And what does that mean for us on a day-to-day basis and how to navigate that in the real world? Because I kept it very high level and very theoretical and very much around the context building up to the actions. And that's where my mistake was. So I'm failing forward here. I'm readjusting my puzzle pieces and I'm repicturing my puzzle. That's literally what I'm doing in this pace. And that's exactly what talent innovation is. And that's exactly what you're doing when you're creating these different plans to navigate the changing economic environments that are occurring on a day-to-day basis. So just remember that you are a hawk. You are both a hawk and a turtle. And the goal here is to facilitate more preference on a day-to-day basis in struggling situations to being a hawk. Your role is directly causation relationship with the economy and correlated. Like everything you do on a day-to-day basis is correlated to the economy, but there's also a direct causation relationship. You are directly tied in a lot of ways to the economy. A lot of positions are, but you are a very unique position in that sense on how you are an operator and stage manager and how all that plays out, right? So remember that perception matters, manipulation is real. We walked through that, how I was able to kind of showcase that example of how manipulation can happen. Understanding how communication is occurring, where information is coming from is important, and making sure you're having those conversations so that you are not a turtle and just reacting to information that's coming into you, but you're proactively engaging those confirmations and conversations to confirm what needs to happen. Planning is going to be really important, but sharpening your claws really comes down to your resources. What do you have to lean on? Who can you ask help from? What communities can you draw from? What do you have currently that you can invest further in terms of time and really understanding the ability to perform in those different areas? You can fly and also be a turtle. Don't be afraid of that. But at the same time, as you are transitioning from turtle to hawk and hawk to turtle, depending on the situation, what you're doing regardless is about building an infrastructure like bamboo. It is an extremely stable, solid infrastructure that can help the company grow and facilitate exponential growth over time, right? That's the goal. But it has to be flexible enough to change in the time of wind, right? When wind comes and shift with the wind and times of change. So you're transitioning from a turtle to a hawk to build a bamboo structure. It takes time, it takes practice, but that's what's important to really navigate how the economy affects your job and how to actually understand what to do to be prepared and move from somebody that's just following orders to somebody that can actually be a part of the conversation to facilitate real change that has an impact to an individual level within your organizations. And that's really what a talent innovator is. You're having those conversations candidly, respectfully, and not being afraid of what may happen navigating it as such, adjusting as such, and ensuring that the individual impact is not as negative as it could be. Really trying to create change there in some way, shape, or form. That's really the key here. So at this point in time, I said thank you and asked for questions. Again, not obviously the best situation to come up and say, hey, I didn't do so great, guys. I'm sorry. It's really just to showcase that I'm not afraid to admit and acknowledge where I may have done better. And hopefully the goal here was to really deliver the message that I was hoping to deliver, which is for you to walk away with something that helps you prepare navigating these types of things that occur in your day-to-day. Knowing that when somebody relays a piece of information to you that's a decision, how you can possibly start a conversation back and say, is this the absolute must that we must do? Is there another way to think about it? Let's have that conversation. Let's look at the P&L. Let's look at our budgets. Really understanding those different types of nuances and stepping into that and leaning into that is really the key on how to navigate the economy and how it impacts our jobs. We want to make sure that in our particular position, we're able to facilitate success for everyone involved. That's really hard to do. You're never going to please everybody, but there is a balancing act that you and you alone have the ability to balance here when it comes to being a turtle to a hawk. And when you're a hawk, you're more able to create a situation of balance where you can create a good business outcome and also a good outcome for people involved as well. You're not always going to win on both sides. There's going to be the teeter-tottering over time. But the key here is to create as much balance as you can. And the only way to do that is to really understand how to fly high above everything and understand how to navigate it and dive in where you need to dive in at the time that it's needed, just like a hawk does when they hunt. So thank you so much for going down this journey with me. I hope that you got something out of it. I really appreciate this extra time and this ability for me to create this course correction. Again, this is really kind of selfish for me because it's really just because I didn't feel like I gave what I wanted to give, and I want to give that opportunity again. And that's really for me. So I do appreciate you sticking in there with me. And if you ever have any questions or if you ever just want to chit chat or anything along those lines, I'm always around. I'm a very outspoken HR nerd. And so I'm happy to always have those conversations. Thank you so much.